Hello, it's Maggie, the Cheshire Crafter here. I've been making this quilt, which I've made from half a layer cake. So I've used 20 10-inch squares and added white to it. I've called this the Honeybee half layer cake quilt. And it's based upon a quilt pattern by Missouri Stark Quilt Company. Jenny Doan has called hers the Half and Half Quilt. But I'm going to show you how to make it as an amateur like me and how to overcome some of the problems that might arise to generate this patchwork quilt topper. I'll probably do a part 2 where I add borders and quilt it. But for now, let's see where to begin. It's a gorgeous fabric with honeybees, rich, they look like velvet on cotton fabric. This is 10-inch cotton by a company called Rose and Hubble. I buy this on eBay, and I'll put the details below. And I'm just going to cut some white cotton 10-inch squares to match the layer cake size. So now I have 20 10-inch squares in white. The next step is to put the pieces together, right sides together. Of course, there's no pattern on the white, but right sides together, pin them, and then I'm going to sew a 1/4-inch seam around all 4 sides on each layer cake layer. So I'm back at my kitchen table with my vintage hand-cranked Singer sewing machine. The new machine that I bought, the Singer Starlet, is going back to the manufacturer to be tested because there's a problem with it. So I'm going to do this sewing on here. I'm using a Silco mercerized cotton thread, 50 weight, in the top and in the bobbin, and I've changed to a 90 needle. And I've tested the tension, and I've also made sure I've got belt and braces, and really need to make sure I've got a good 1/4-inch seam. I've used a bit of tape, and I've got the magnetic 1/4-inch marker as well. And that measures exactly 1/4 of an inch from needle to this inside edge. So let's get started sewing. I haven't altered the stitch length on this machine, but I'd aim for a stitch length for this project of about 2.0. I'm between that and 2.5, I think, on this one. Now that they're all sewn, the next step is to cut from corner to corner on both diagonals. And I still find it helpful to use a dumbbell to hold the weight of the easy rule down at this point, because the last thing I want to do is for this hand to slip on the fabric. A dumbbell really helps weight it. I now have 80 pieces, and I'm going to set the seam with the iron, and then I'm going to press it back so that the seam goes underneath the patterned fabric, not under the white cotton, so it doesn't show through. I'm going to do that with a steam iron. I'm going to leave that stack to cool off, and while that's happening, I'm going to get myself something to eat, and I quite fancy a drink with some honey in it. The next step is to square these up, and for this I'm going to use my 6.5-inch ruler, and you can see that these are just a little bit bigger than 6.5-inch, and I'm going to place my 45-degree line right on that fold line, and then cut along either side of it. And you can see on these, I've used the Easy Grip discs to help hold this ruler in place and stop it from slipping. I need 2 hands though for this. When cutting, try using the edge of the mat that never gets used. You'll get a much sharper cut that way. You can tell I've had a Tesco shop, can't you? Because that melon is a giveaway. Right, more cutting now. The design of this quilt takes 2 alternating blocks, but they're both cut in the same way. So I'm now going to cut each of these half square triangles in half. And in half, I'm going to use my easy rule. And if you look at the easy rule right way up, to cut them in half, I need the 3 1/4 mark. And actually, your eye wants to go to the 3 1/2 inch mark. So to mark that, I'm going to use purple tape. You can see I've used any tape on this, washi tape, anything to stop you going to that line instead of that one, because it will throw everything out completely. And for a right-hand person, you'll see that I've had to turn the ruler upside down, so it's even more important. But I can now see I need that purple line on the edge of the fabric, just like that. And I'm now going to cut down the middle and then across. All 80 half square triangles are going to be cut in the same way. Don't be confused, because I'm going to show you on yellow as well. So now you have 3 1/2 inch squares, and I'm going to change the 2 block pieces over, and I now have a 4 patch. I'm now going to sew them together, first of all down the middle, and then also top to bottom on the machine. I'm going to pin these before I go and cut another piece, so I know that I've got the orientation right. Pin them on the side that I'm going to sew them, because when I sew them, I need to turn those upside down on the machine. And I'm going to mark them with a post-it note, A and B. Marking them will help with the orientation, because I now know that that's upside down. I'm going to cut the yellow exactly the same and show you what that looks like too. I'm using flower head pins for a reason. If you put the pins in with the flower head at the top, by the time they go to the sewing machine, they're in the right orientation for you to take it out. So you can sew right up to here before you have to take that pin out. That's helpful. And the other thing is, I've only actually cut 4 squares of each colour at the moment. I recommend that you take these to your sewing machine and make sure you've got your methodology right before you proceed any further. I know that I'm going to need to iron these seams open, so I'm going to put the iron on while I'm at the machine. Now you'll understand what I mean about the orientation. I need 1/4 inch seams throughout. And the last thing I want to do here, you can see I'm going to start stitching where I'm going to almost straight away come into a crossing seam. And it might be because I'm on an older machine, but the last thing I want to do is to churn that fabric up at that point. I want a crisp point, so I'm not going to do a back stitch. I'm going to do a forward stitch throughout. And I'm going to stitch right to the end. On point B, I'm upside down and back to front, and I can't see where that seam is. Just make sure that your seam is lying flat as you present that fabric to the needle. The top one is right, the bottom one is wrong. If you end up like a smaller half square triangle, you've gone wrong. You want it to look like this. And what happened, I think, when I was sewing A and B together, I got B at the top and A at the bottom, and that's wrong. This is the importance of getting your orientation right as you're sewing it. The more you sew, the easier you'll find it is to get the pattern. I always recommend that you keep the pattern by your side to refer to, but you can chain piece. And at this point, I don't need to label with paper my pieces, and I don't need to pin them either. What I do look at before I put them to the machine is, does it match that pattern? And for the orientation, it's helpful to look at, is the piece I'm presenting to the machine the same as the one above it? If I had it that way, I would know I'd got it wrong. Assuming I've got that piece right and this piece right first. When sewing together the full patch, I do use pins to make sure that these seams nest. And when I sew, I'll be sewing this direction. I want my needle to hit just right here, just to the one side of it, so I get a good point and it doesn't cut my points off, and I'm still using my 1/4 inch seam guide. I'm going to stop and have something to eat, but what I want to show you how to turn this into pattern A and this into pattern B. And it's simple. I want a block where I have the whites in the centre, and I'm going to create a 4 patch here. I'll just try and avoid my sink. So that's going to be pattern A. How nice is that? So you get this diamond shape within it. And then I'm probably going to have to overlap, but then I want one where I've got the colours in the middle. So let's do that. And this time you see that the diamond shape comes from the whites coming together. And then I'm going to sew that as a simple 4 patch again. Again, get your orientations correct. I'm going to sew that to that, that to that, and then those two together. And when I've done that, I'll show you what that looks like. First of all, I'm going to get some tea. Again, you sew this as a 4 patch. So I've sewn A to B and A to B, and I'm now going to add top to bottom. And on this one, I've put the whites in the centres. On the next one, I'm going to do 2 of these. On the next one, I'm going to put the pattern in the centre to make a central square. And you'll see that you get an outside diamond pattern emerging. It's important here that your seams meet, so I recommend pinning, because you need to meet this point, your centre point, and then make sure that by the time you come to your end point, those seams meet together. I'm not worried about the direction that the bees are flying in, because it just looked like a swarm of bees, and that's the image I want for this design. If you're doing a directional print though, remember that these will all be in different directions, and it will be particularly noticeable with some designs more than another. Take that into account when you're choosing your fabric for this. There, I have the finished block showing 2 designs using the same piece of fabric. I've now made 20 blocks, and I'm going to do this on a design board, which means I'm doing it on my bed, and I'm going to do 4 across and 5 down. Let's see what that looks like. Well, I've laid out my design, and I've tried to get alternating white centres and pattern centres, and I've ended up with a bit of a here I've ended up with a bit of a black diagonal going across, but I've tried to weight it down with some of the darker greys further down at the bottom. Now I'm going to sew this together, going from across, sewing the rows together first, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I'll sew row 1 to row 2, row 2 to row 3, row 3 to row 4. Well, there's the completed patchwork topper. It now measures 44 by 55. I now need to add some borders, and I'll do that with white and yellow. Come back to me for the second video and watch as I add the borders and then complete the backing and quilt this. But for now, this is Maggie, the Cheshire Crafter, saying, come back and see me soon, won't you? Bye.